I'd like to start by just saying thank you to IFASA for the opportunity to share with you today my experience as far as the immune system is concerned. I am an immunopathologist. I'm with the University of Stellenbosch. I have been for the last 32 years. So what I'd like to share with you this morning is basically our experience, well, my experience as far as the testing of the immune system when it comes to infertility. Our previous speaker just alluded to this journey that you folks go through, and it's the more I deal with patients, the more I realize how it must be very difficult and how lucky I was that my wife and I both didn't battle to have children. So I'll be talking to you about the immunology of the endometrium, and the question is whether this is the best chance of success. Please, folks, this is not the only answer, but to me, the more I deal with the infertility and the immune testing, the more I realize that the immunology does play a role. You have to remember that a pregnancy is a symbiosis between two allogeneic individuals. Okay? In other words, allogeneic means that that fetus carries the fingerprints which triggers an immune response between the mother and the father. So it is in fact a half foreign body trying to implant into the woman's endometrium. So what we know is that the maternal immune system status, if it is tolerant, tolerance is an immunological term that is used to say to the immune cells, we've trained you to be aggressive, we've trained you to get rid of everything foreign. That is why we can fight off viruses, bacteria, parasites. But when it comes to the endometrium, we want you to chill. We want you to be of such a nature that you allow the implantation and that you become tolerant. If not, the woman might present with a very aggressive barrier, thereby leading to these spontaneous abortions or recurrent fetal loss or just lack of implantation. So infertility to me is a fact, and it is irreversible. I don't like calling the immune system of infertility as an infertility issue, but rather a lack of implantation. So we often refer to women as SRAs, spontaneous recurrent aborters, and there are several factors. I'm only touching on the one here this morning. I mean, obviously we have to consider the hormonal status. We can't fall pregnant unless we have the right profile. There might be physical, mechanical issues involved, but I will not touch on those. I will concentrate purely on what are the possible underlying immune factors that could lead to lack of implantation and infertility. So when we speak about the immune cells, we have different compartments. In the peripheral blood, if we look at the immune cells of the peripheral blood, they tend to be extremely aggressive. Okay? You might have heard about this maybe on your Facebook groups, etc. We talk about T cells, T regulatory cells. These are very important suppressive cells. Very low concentrations of the circulating T cells happen to be T regs, something like 5–6%. Then we have the NKs. I'm sure all the infertility couples have come across this natural killer. In the peripheral blood, it is a killer. That's why we call it the NK cell. We also have others, such as the NKTs, the natural killer T cells, the most aggressive of them all. But when it comes to the endometrium, the profile is very, very different, in that the cells are all of the immunosuppressive tolerant type. And that is why I don't like using the term NKs when we talk to the endometrium, because that is why I prefer to use the term uterine or the endometrial NKs, because we have to differentiate between these cells and those that circulate in the peripheral blood. Here, they induce a state of tolerance. The T regulatory cells are suppressive cells. They work together, and very often in women who have themselves tested, where we actually detect very raised natural killer T cells and T cells themselves, we very, very often suspect a viral etiology. Very often, papillomavirus is at play here. Papilloma and other pathogens such as disturbed microbiome, which I will touch on as well. So what we do and what we offer at Synexa is that we actually do this immune profiling on menstrual blood, because we know that the menstrual blood resembles the uterine lining. I mean, the menstrual blood is literally the endometrium being sloughed off at the end of an unsuccessful cycle. So basically in the endometrium, the endometrial microenvironment, we can detect that by doing these blood tests in a sample of the menstrual blood that we get the ladies to collect. I mentioned those NKs. I mean, in the peripheral blood, they're called natural killers because that is exactly what they do. They are extremely aggressive. Whereas here in the actual uterus, in the endometrium, they are extremely different in that they secrete very different types of immune factors. So their sole purpose of being in the uterus is to create this environment of being baby-friendly. So if you do read and you come across the term natural killers, very often there were studies that were done quite a long time ago where they showed that ladies with raised NK cells in the blood tended to have problems with implantation. But here we are talking about the NKs in the uterus, very different type of immune cell. In fact, it's a pity that we call them NK cells. They should in fact be baby-friendly immune cells. So just to highlight this point again, and that is in the uterus they tend to be immunoregulatory, whereas in the peripheral blood they are cytotoxic aggressive cells. They stain, or we look at the cells by a special instrument called the flow cytometer. We can stain them, we can see them at exactly using the same markers, but it is only when we look at the factors which those cells secrete that we can actually differentiate them. And we can also see, for instance, that in the uterus, they tend to be high cytokine, gamma, TGF-beta. These are all the immunosuppressive type of factors, whereas in the peripheral blood, they tend to be extremely cytotoxic cells that kill transformed or cancer cells. What's interesting to note, and that is several studies have indicated why or have implied why these cells are very important, because if you look at a normal cycle, ovulation taking place around about 10, 12 days, 15 days, and you will notice that those natural killer cells, or the NK cells, increase near the end of that cycle. The reason for that is because they responded directly to the activity of progesterone. So if the woman does not show the progesterone surge, she tends to present with low UNKs. Whereas a normal cycling lady, these cells increase in numbers near the end of that cycle because it's preparing the uterus to receive that baby, creating that baby-friendly, tolerant profile. So the UNKs in endometrium, they differentiate into biological types of cells producing very, very different types of cytokines, or these factors. They allow the invasion of the trophoblast into the decidua, and they change in numbers from early pregnancy to mid-gestation. Under the surge of progesterone, they double up in numbers every 10 days. And what's interesting is if you manage to actually sample a woman going into natural birth, there's a sudden drop in these numbers near the end of that gestation. So it's directly linked between promoting the pregnancy and at the time when there's a sudden change in the hormonal profiles so that the woman can give birth, these cells actually decrease in numbers once again. I've mentioned T cells. T cells are aggressive. There are two types that we can actually identify. Very important is that the Th1s are pro-inflammatory and it favors implantation just at the time of implantation, but thereafter we should see a change to the so-called Th2, chilled, immune-suppressed type of state. and we very, very often detect very raised Th1 cells circulating in women with lack of implantation. What we ultimately want is that just in the beginning, as that little fetus embryo is trying to implant, we should have a Th1, but with time it should swing and become a pregnancy-promoting Th2 profile. And interestingly enough, together again with the progesterone, it actually promotes the Th2 to increase in numbers together with the UNKs. Let's just talk about these very strange T regulatory cells, low in frequency. In the peripheral blood, no more than 5–6%. What we do know is that they are outright immunosuppressive, and these are the two factors which are very important to allow implantation to take place, namely IL-10 and TGF-beta. And what's interesting is that, again, with pregnancy, they increase in numbers. They work hand in hand with the UNKs to create that immune-suppressed tolerant state, and they're obviously positively correlated to UNKs. So what we do is, when we get the sample of the menstrual blood from the ladies, we actually do this profile. And folks, I want to just leave you with a thought that should you be showing the profile which is aggressive, it is reversible. We can intervene and change that profile to make you baby-friendly, to make you show this change and show increases in UNKs, increases in Tregs, and obviously increases in Th2s. It's reversible. So it's a fine balance between the Th1 and the Tregs, as indicated here. A normal pregnancy, you would see a predominance of T regulatory cells and very less or very few aggressive Th1 cells. For a good, that would be a normal pregnancy. In the case of infertility, miscarriages, even preeclampsia, we tend to see an increase in those aggressive Th1 cells and not enough reining in, not enough of that suppression leading to a successful pregnancy. We're now at the point where pharma is now looking at ways of increasing T regulatory cells specifically for infertility management. So it's coming. We have the tools, we have the immunology knowledge, we know what cells to target, so it will be coming, hopefully soon, because we are in fact currently involved with a clinical study where we're looking at ways and means, which I'll touch on now, of increasing these T regulatory cells naturally. Namely, the microbiome. I'm sure that every single one of you here, you've opened up a journal, you've looked at articles about IBS and these friendly hojas in your digestive system. We've learned a lot from a condition known as IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. Because basically IBS is a disturbance of that microbiome, of that normal flora. And if you look at the immune cells in the digestive system of these women and men, you will notice that they carry loads of pathogens, bacterial species that should not be there, bacterial species that actually trigger inflammation. And this is a hidden compartment or component that contributes to infertility. I am very sure that many of the infertility patients that go to the clinics, they're very, very seldom asked about how is your digestive system? Do you battle with milk? Do you battle with gluten? The reason being, there's a direct link between the microbiome and inflammation arising from the gut and lack of implantation. So let me just explain to you what I mean by this. If this is the mucosal surface of your gut, that is the mucus there, and all those little black dots are in fact friendly bacteria that should be there. Why are they there? Firstly, they play a very important role as far as digestion, metabolism, and absorption. If they're disturbed, the person knows about that. What's even more important is the direct immunological role they play, not only in the gut, but in other compartments, including the uterus and endometrium. Namely, these bacteria are taken up by specialized cells called dendritic cells. They are eaters. They just push out these long arms, eat the bacteria, and by doing so, it activates those suppressive cells, those T-regulatory cells in our digestive system, not to react. Because if we do react to ingested food, we start developing food intolerances. It's an antibody to which you will form to the ingested proteins, and that is why very often when you ask the right questions, the person says to you, I feel terrible 2-3 days after eating eggs. I feel terrible every time I eat wheat. I feel terrible after I've had any dairy. The reason being because that commensal layer of friendly bacteria, the normal flora, is disturbed, meaning that that activation here does not take place, with the result that the T regulatory cells can't be activated. No activated suppression, we have an immune reaction. And the same applies to the uterus. Exactly the same flora, maybe not exactly the same as what we carry in our digestive system, but certainly uterine microbiome plays exactly the same role. And that is, if those bacteria are disturbed, they do not activate those T regulatory cells. With no T regulatory cells, we have an inflammatory response. And inflammation leads to the fetal loss or lack of implantation. So very exciting, and that there are now companies, we're busy doing a project with them at the moment, developing specific microbiome to be used in women with infertility. In other words, it will be a pessary that the lady just inserts, and with the hope that by reinstating that microbiome barrier, we will reinstate the activity of the immune cells in that endometrium. So there are new cells being identified. These are so-called myeloid-derived suppressor cells. We see it in the blood, but very interestingly, for the ladies who have very few of them in the endometrium, very often leads to early miscarriage. So everything points to an immune mechanism allowing you to implant properly and to actually carry that baby. Okay? It's one of the components. So does immunology play a role? In my mind, yes, it does. It's a yin-yang. Like everything, we should be balanced. It's good to have inflammatory cells, but it's also good to have regulatory cells. You can't only just be pro-inflammatory, because that leads to the chronic conditions linked with chronic inflammation. We have to have the yangs, not only the yings. So we don't have all the answers yet, but the more I deal with infertility patients, the more I realize that very often we don't give them the full picture. We don't give them all the opportunities to ask the right questions. Immune system does play a role, folks. Remember, it is half foreign, trying to implant into you. It's even worse when we have to have recourse to donor eggs. It's a double whammer, trying to implant into your uterus. So, unless things are correct, unless your digestion is also seen to, and unless your immune system is balanced at that barrier, one will battle. More heartache, more disappointments, and can't be an easy life for you ladies. So it must be a holistic approach. I do believe that both the digestive or the gut microbiome as well as uterine microbiome needs attention. Look at the peripheral blood profiling. Is the woman showing the aggressive Th1 type of profile? Definitely the most direct compartment to assay is the endometrial menstrual blood sample. In the infertility managed, let's not forget the emotional cost. And I've heard this just in the last two speakers, how very often we don't even put a price to that. Very, very, very important. Let's be more open to additional, call it complementary approaches. And in my mind, the male needs attention. We are going ahead doing IVFs, XCs from samples derived from males who tend to be metabolic syndrome, not a very good environment to collect the sample from. So thank you for your attention. I hope I've brought some hope. Unfortunately, I have to rush off back to the airport to get back to Cape Town for a wedding, so I'm not going to be around to chat to you all, but please just note my email address. You are welcome to communicate, very open to chat anytime. I'm not pushing tests. If you want advice, please don't hesitate to call on me, and I'll see what I can do from our side. But thank you so much.